Alastair actually asked this question today. Talk about mixing color and middle tones versus blending and blurring a la Tarbell and the mosaic discussion. Now, Alastair is somebody who knows these quotes that I'm about to offer you, and yet the issue comes up over and over again. This question of blending, or even the idea of blurring. I think of when you talk about painting, you're actually I think about slurring. That's why you sloppily run one note into another and don't pay attention to how well expressed that area is in its local truth. And it's a funny way to say that, but I mean, we'll get into it in just a second. But there's this idea of slurring, which I think of as blurring. I think of blurring in a very limited way. That is, when you want to see who's the most prominent, what the most prominent effects are in a picture, you blur your eyes. And when you want to see which things hang together the most and how the unities are working visually, you just blur your eyes. Okay, that's blurring is a very positive thing. So this sounds like a blurring, even maybe blending is or pejorative terms. But this is a very interesting question, the question about mixing color and middle tones. How do you do that? I mean, a lot of what we do, of course, in fact, the better part of what we do is called mixing on the canvas. We don't actually pre-mix colors and assume that they're going to be okay, because they need to be up there on the wall, so to speak, up on the picture plane, side by side with each other, so we can see what the ensemble is doing, what the relationships are. So that's really our game if we're observers of the visual world in its totality. It's all encompassing color, value, drawing, et cetera, ways. So let me just start off with, though, because he mentions the Tarbell and the mosaic discussion. Let's just go straight to that quote, if I can successfully do that. Here we go. So this is from Dean Warren, who was the first president, I believe, maybe a stand-in president at Boston University. And I mentioned, I think maybe to you before, that I believe that school was actually a local Bible college up here in Vermont, in a town called Newbury, Vermont. And so it's rather fascinating for me, at least, to have a kind of a local connection to this sitter. He was a sitter for Dean Warren, as you can see there. But anyway, he was that first president, as I understand it. Here's what he said, quoting in an article called 24 Sittings with Edmund Tarbell, which I can give you if you'll just ask me. Just send me an email or whatever, and I'll send you a copy of it or a link to it. You might be able to find a link online. I've never put it there, but I believe a copy of it is available on one or more of my websites. Okay, this is it. The first principle of Mr. Tarbell's practice was well served by the technique he had adopted here in Boston from one of his earliest teachers, Otto Grundmann, who himself had been trained in it by Baron Henrik Leys of Antwerp. In itself, this old Netherlandish method, like the Golden Rule, is easier to understand than to carry out. Its main point is merely to give each little area of the painting its own paint, right in hue and value, without further modification from or into adjoining areas. Well, that sort of without modification into adjoining areas, that suggests the slurring idea, right? Without just smudging it into something. This method is akin to that of the mosaic maker, which, as you know, are hard pieces of color cut into shapes, and they're pasted side by side by side by side by side and the colors shift as they need to, but it's done by the spot, a little bit like the pointillist mentality, or a little bit like the even the pixels in a photograph or in a magazine. If they still do that, I think they still do that. But if you've ever seen that close up, you'll see that they're a bunch of series of circles of color that make up any area of a print in a magazine, of a color area of a magazine. All right. The method is akin to that of the mosaic maker. Half-tones are to be painted as half-tones, not mixed on the canvas by pulling a dark stroke into a lighter. And by the way, they do that, but when the note is wrong, they'll adjust, okay? So don't say they don't drag notes together, and I wouldn't say anything more about that. Just leave it as simple as that. You don't want to tie your hands and make yourself into and limit your ability to express the visual impression in any way. And the idea of making everything a pockmark like a mosaic would be to inhibit the truth of the visual impression. So don't take this simplistically, okay? you'll be able to read this again on your own time, fortunately, right? When each area has been thus independently treated, and any needed transitions have been made, not by wiping one color into another, but by adding intermediate touches, the picture is finished. Sometimes a little loosely, the method is called painting by planes. And that's where you hear that expression coming out of Carolus Duran. You see it in its extreme effect in Franz Hall's canvases. He took too little care to join his planes as they are joined in nature. He pushed the square touch too far. That point about Franz Hall's, that's true of some of his paintings, not true of all of them. It's also true of some of his paintings that he does what this guy would call wiping one color into another. So he wasn't a careful colorist, let me just put it that way. So let's just look at their work, okay? Well, let's just start with Tarbell, actually. I want to show you this because I want you to have seen it, and I'm going to refer to it probably again. But I'm bringing you this close-up of the Tarbell head to show you how thoughtfully it's painted in each spot all through the entire, let's see if I can get my arrow working again, through any passage around through here, all these things, you can see there's an actual color, a meaningful color in all these places. It doesn't feel like it's been slurred or blurred. But for somebody who doesn't know the difference, this probably isn't even visible to you. So let me go on further and compare some other things. So this is the Franz Hall's square touch thing that he's talking about. It's particularly obnoxious, I guess you could say here. Although you'd argue that if this is his approach and this is merely the first bunch of notes he's putting down there, who's to attack it, right? It's more impressive here, and yet you can. But anyway, you can still see the sort of these shots, these sharp-edged shots, chunked onto there, in various places. Up in here, you'd actually argue there's actually some more, maybe something more like slurring, if you want to call it that, or blurring of, blending. Oh, these cursed words. Anyway, but this is Duveneck doing the same thing. A guy that I think Sargent called the greatest magician of the brush or something or other in America. But it's very evident though that the presence of just put down a touch and leave it in this way of working. Duveneck was the teacher of de Kamp, or at least closely involved in influencing Joseph de Kamp and others. All right, but now what I really wanted to give you, having seen Tarbell, is I want to give you Ang. This is exactly the opposite of that way of working. And you'll see what the result is when you work this way. So instead of like drawing a line around the hair, right, as Ang has done here, and by the way, you can argue, of course, that the guy had slicked down hair and maybe it just did that. But instead of doing that, you'll see this orientation around making a fleck and a disappearing, middle tone, disappearing middle tones at various places, and another articulated spot, right? And this is that put down a mark and leave it sort of spot. But you'll see that throughout this entire thing. And I think I think you'd be hard pressed to say that this one here is actually more visually truthful than this one. And I say especially in terms of color, but it's also true of the texture of the face and all those things, which you're giving yourself time to produce by thinking that way. But I want you to see that. I want to be very clear to you that this is that idea of just fluid edges every place, just equally sort of sharply cut or smoothly cut, But smoothing of edges is not a big deal. There is such a thing as an edge that actually presents as what we'd call smooth, You'd be a wet into wet edge. And by the way, the Boston School guys say if you're not painting wet into wet, you're not painting. And they will talk about the quality of the edges. So that relative softness with a painterly handling, so it's a beautiful looking softness, is what you see exactly here. It's not lost on these guys. They aren't hacking at these things with crummy, non-wet edges. Sometimes they are, by the way, and Tarbell's rather famous for his Tarbell edge, which has to do with that exotic sharpness that may be too sharp. When he's setting his anchoring thing, the argument is that he may set his edges sharp like a paper edge, paper cutting, when he shouldn't. But nevertheless, this is what you're seeing here is that mentality that was just expressed, putting down a spot and in a mosaic-like fashion, every spot being true to its own color. The thing that makes it work is that is their guy's preconception of its unity. So, you can paint a color note like this, paint some color blob there, make an egg out of it, and make it do the right thing as a general impression color, and then do your drawing within it, which is that's the way I take that basically this Ang works, or most academics work. But this requires you to actually hold in your mind the unity of the color scheme while you're actually attacking individual spots. So you're never attacking a little spot for its own sake, even though you want it true in its own spot, but you're going after it to produce this big unity of this big impression. And that's Monet 101, right? That's true. So this is talking about Monet. When you go out to paint, this is Monet talking, and Monet is told to Little Cabot Perry, who is the Boston connection for some of these guys, to Monet. And so this is the words of Monet. When you go out to paint, try to forget what objects you have before you, a tree, a house, a field, or whatever. So in other words, he's decrying the idea of learning, how to paint the nose, how to paint the house, the tree, the whatever. He says, merely think, here is a little square of blue, here's an oblong of pink, here's a streak of yellow, and paint it just as it looks to you, the exact color and shape until it gives you your own naive impression of the scene before you. So there's again that idea of painting, not a subject idea, an object idea, but a value relationship, the idea of a spot of color. And of course, he doesn't get into that idea. He makes it sound like it's a local color problem, but actually it isn't. As you can see in Monet's own work, he's actually producing all these little spots are adding up to a grand unity. So as to preconceive this great unity, and every mark he makes has to be, even though they're little dots, they have to be after this grand unity, which really takes an art. It takes a bit of exercise to sort out, right, how that could possibly work. But it's no more complicated than doing the gesture of a standing figure. Now, I want you to look at these three. These are three of my favorite Monets, and I picked them because of their complications. It's just very complicated in their drawing and all that sort of stuff. This is a gorge, the Creuse, I think it's called the Creuse, the Little Creuse, the Petit Creuse River in France. And I want you to see these three different locations, three different times of day, three different kinds of days, perhaps, and just enjoy the unity, the really impressive unity. Isn't that something else again, right? Now, again, this is not blended work, is it? This is actually putting down a spot and leaving it in that way that people talk about eventually in this conversation here. So Chardin's matter. Now, this comes when you talk about the mosaic. This is actually really coming from the Chardin conversation, and the word mosaic is Tarbell brings that out of the Chardin background. Here it is, the quote, and this is Charles Ormond quoting a contemporary of Chardin. Chardin's manner of painting is singular. He places his colors alongside of each other, almost without mixing them, so that the work looks like mosaic or patchwork. Now you look at his work, and you'll say, "Really? Does it really look like that?" Well, not in the simplistic way, no, but or there again, and this is back in that day too. It says, or like that of handmade tapestry called pointe-carré, I can't remember how that's pronounced. So the only justification for such a rough and unpolished manner of painting was a thorough knowledge of the effect that colors produce upon one another. Now there's the key right there again, the effect that colors produce upon one another, that's called color relating, right? And if you can't do that, this will never work for you. If you actually you haven't trained yourself to do that, this won't work for you. So let's look at Chardin. And I like this one here because of its, but you can see these wonderful variations in the color, and yet you see the unity of the plum. And, some of these look considerably more simplistic, but just enjoy this passage here. It's just a delight. It's just exactly the kind of stuff that lends itself to being a model for the modern impressionist, as it were. But I mean, if I would actually suggest to you the modern impressionist, meaning you and me, the person who actually respects a deeper, a more profound element of drawing that never becomes photography. And again, following that model that Hale talks about, where the drawing is the color. I mean, the fact is, all those things are factors simultaneously. I picked this one also because in the tail here, you can see those sort of square marks put down like touches. That's visual seeing. He's not up there making feathers at any point. At these points in here, by the way, these little pieces, all that sort of stuff, that's the way the drawing actually articulates. But look at this spot. Put down a spot and leave it. Put down a spot and leave it. which I haven't brought to you yet. But now here, this is, as you probably well known if you've listened to my videos, this is Joseph de Kamp doing exactly that. He's not making a cup, right? He's putting down spots, color value spots. And he's evolving a cup. He's evolving a cup simultaneously with the evolution of a total impression of what we call the ensemble of an area, or the grand ensemble, right? The big look of this area. It's exactly the same as what I just explained about Monet. And what I say about the figure, you understand the gesture of the figure is all those composite little pieces getting together to do one thing. And so there's that inherent unity, that search for color relations and value relations, effect relations, and in every way that corresponds with exactly what we're talking about here, and in Monet previously. And so here I'm showing it to you again. This is a particularly easy one. It's a nice big picture. It's very easy to see in nature, in person. It's very easy to see the marks put down and left, put down and left, put down and left. Some places it's where you see there's a significant unity and you can't see variations. He doesn't overdo that. He doesn't go looking in for trouble that doesn't exist. And that's a big deal with the way we think. Keep yourself big. Keep yourself thinking, what is this doing as a whole? And yet, every little mark matters. And there may be shifts in here that you're totally unaware of. There's an interesting thing where this has to be such and such a light that it is virtually the same value as the forehead. And by the time you get up here, it has to be weak enough so that it doesn't look like this goofy light against this sky. So this would happen if you maintain that light. You get this contrast. Well, it's going to get down to this contrast. Yet you can't see a value movement, right? You can't see it. It's happening though, right? You can't see it easily. So, but the contrast here tells you that he shifted values. So there's a unity thing here that he's after, even while he's doing a note at a time, and you might argue a form idea at a time, or hair at a time. So, but you can see the same thing in each passage of this thing. It wouldn't matter where you went, there's that beautiful quality of going after the color mark. Now, what does this have to do with blending and blurring, right? So there are places where blurring, in this kind of a case, where edges are softer, and you can call that blurring, but it's actually the look of nature. There are differences in edges. Some edges along, like this blue meets, and by the way, edges means where a value meets another value, right? Or anything meets another anything. This is a high contrast edge with a certain sharpness, right? This one has a softer contrast, a softer transition. Now that's not slurring and blurring, that's the look of nature at that spot. So if you want to, if you're thinking that's blurring or blending, and you mean really you're just running two colors into each other and you lose the color quality there, you would have to go and remake it with a different middle tone so that it actually has the color quality exactly right where the dark meets the middle tone, meets the light, etc., right, traveling that way. So if you can have that in mind, that there's such a thing as edge quality, and there's so you don't have to put these down as pock marks all the way along the edge here. Paxton does that frequently. Let's see if one of these pictures is a Paxton in it. Yeah. Where you see him doing that, he seems more hesitant, more reticent about expressing the linear, unity of an edge. And I find that not visually true. It's almost approaching it more like an impressionist in the blotch way, which is a description of this, every spot. But it's very like what we're doing. In fact, this is mosaic-like, and some of these are the most exquisite color movements you'll ever see in your life in a figure, in a nude, in the human skin. And Bouguereau and his delightful fingers and toes notwithstanding, I've never seen Bouguereau do this. This is uncanny, this skill that this guy applies. Beautiful form. And this is a backlight, right? Here's the leading light. Here's a backlight with its own form and great color values, shifts, movements, right through the beauty of a great form. But again, you can see that he's not after almost anything specific except the color in the spot. So there's this redder note between the dark and the cheek, dark of the hair and the cheek, and all these things. And yet he's, as I said, he's more reticent to shoot a clean line. That makes a significant difference between him and some others of the Boston School, but particularly de Kamp. But yeah, what's not to love, right? Blending and blurring, right? So he does this less, what I'm going to call the fluid line. He runs that less. He's more about being almost like religious about it, putting them blotches and leaving them in this study. Not always. Now this is a similar type of thing. This is Benson, but you can see, and that's why I picked this passage here. You can see that it's actually after the look. What's happening here. No, you can put down a big blob here, but at some point you see that there's a difference between the value of this and this, And so you need to put that down, and it has its own color, right? Now, the reason he's making his marks like this is because this is a textured cloth, or at least it's coming across the way he's presenting it. It's got internal texture, thread mark, if you want to call it that. So he's making marks that are strongly suggesting those things without becoming this photographic articulation of little noodles of threads. But you can see that in all passages through here. You see this great color thing shifting to this. He doesn't just hold on to this up here, but this right color, right value in the right place is richer over here, lighter over here, less light over here, and less rich, and so on. By the way, one of the things we consistently do, though, is when we put down a note anywhere, first of all, you're getting the light quality. It's a big deal. But you're also comparing it with any other notes like it. So any color note you put down, you compare it with other notes and adjust them to each other until they are right in their play. And that's what opportunity is given to you by approaching this our way. I'm going to get long, I can see that, but I think I'm going to skip this one. You're not going to like that maybe, but I'm going to just jump to this one because I don't want to be exotically long. This is Tarbell painting outdoors. This is Caravaggio. Now, Caravaggio's pictures are basically drawings. I studied with an impressionist early on, Brackman, and he said, is that a painting or is that a color drawing? And these are color drawings. I mean, that's why they're saying it's not pejorative in one sense. I mean, because these guys valued drawing. They were bringing lots to it that hadn't been as strong before. You think especially of Velázquez. And yet Velázquez is the one who leads us to this, right? And this is where you are talking about color and value transitions. See how the blue this is and how gold this is down here. And even the variations from a cooler gold to, with reds in it to and blues to a golder one that's richer, right? And these things are amazing examples, though, of the beauty of the relationships of notes. And so the whole thing is every spot has its own right color in the right place. Well, you can't smear colors together and do drawing and actually get that. You have to pay attention to the note. So you can still get soft edges or whatever. You can do edges like this. You can actually wind up with edges like this. And maybe I should have shown that in the De Kamp. Actually, I do have a couple seconds. Let me go back to that. But I just wanted to show you these as examples. Which one is truer to life? This is not truer to life, no matter what you say, right? That is to say, the fact that the arm doesn't have significant shifts, the flatness is good, the form is good, all those things that relate to drawing is reasonably discussed. But when you talk about a unit like this and there's virtually no shifts in it, it's because of lack of interest. In this case here, you wouldn't say that, even though it does appear like a big red blob, it wasn't for lack of interest. It actually was because it came across almost simplistically to the viewer. Otherwise, he wouldn't have painted shifts in here either. He would have left that to your imagination or whatever, made a big flat blob like that, wouldn't he? And yet that's consistent with this way of working. You make up the color of the cloth and basically draw in that color value. Basically, right? Don't ever take this to be too much of an absolute statement. So this is an example. I just thought these are amusing, by the way, the birds by Joseph de Kamp, and there's the bird on the hand by Paxton. But you can see in both cases, though, where this is that search for color notes and holding their integrity in their locations. And so in some other person's way of working, this might have been drawn like the beautiful dress it is, and then you'd go inside there and I mean like literally as drapery, so it looked like drapery. And then you'd go inside the thing and select more things out of the drapery look. But he's actually created the drapery look out of spots, of course, he's had to conceive of every form, every value, every light effect in here, every edge, by the way, to every other edge. Look at the beauty of this, the smack of this edge. You don't even hardly see another one like it in the picture. I mean, I'll back away from that. This is pretty strong stuff here or here. But the differences between all these edges are nuanced as heck. I mean, because that's what he's doing when he looks at his edges. He doesn't just say, there's the arm. He doesn't do that, which you'd get in the other way of working. So, Alastair, if I covered this, let me just take one last look back at your point, at your question, and I will get out if I have. Talk about mixing color and middle tones versus blending and blurring. So the thing I've told you more than anything else is that it's not so much a mixing. The question of middle tones, to get transitions, is every middle tone has its own value. So when you're talking about this blue here, and then this one here, and then this one, these are all their own color and their own value. The values make the form, and the color itself is there, transitioning like crazy, and it makes a major contribution to the pictorial truth, to the visual truth. Also, though, more than anything else, it gives you a place to really have a good time finding music. You know, the distribution, for example, as I was pointing out, of these yellows and the play of the orange to the yellow to whatever. You know, this is, and I'm going to show this in the next video about Degas. We're going to talk about this stuff, about color, because this is really a big deal. But this gives you an opportunity to play color. And I'm talking about create aesthetic magic with color. You don't get that out of the drawing first model or the color drawing model, except to the extent that Ang does with the color of the blouse versus the color of the hair versus the color of the background, that kind of thing. You do get a little bit of that. So on to the next one, and enjoy. I hope that's helpful, Alastair, and thank you for the question. Do subscribe, share, and do all the above, and see you next time. Okay.